So in the Straw Hat Crew, there is a family dynamic that doesn't really have too much bearing on the actual story, but you do see elements here and there which makes it make a little sense. Now, currently, seeing as how Jinbei has joined, he has replaced Frankie as the father, and now Frankie is supposed to be a perverted grandmother, but this has never made sense to me based on how Frankie and Usopp's relationship has always been fairly fatherly. So I do think if Jinbei does kick the bucket, of which I think he most likely will, Frankie will be restored as the father of the Straw Hat Crew. Now, keeping that in mind, if Loki were to join the Straw Hats, I think he would end up being the uncle because, first off, Frankie is 38 and Loki in giant years is actually 21, but in human years he is 63. But this explains why he's a fairly young man because he's actually 21. So I do think in a way he could be considered Frankie's little brother. And what's so interesting about the two is that both of them have very similar stories. And even some of this spills into what Usopp has gone through. Because Loki was a troubled child hated from birth by his mother. He was dropped into the underworld, and as he grew, he proceeded to cause trouble for the people in the Sun Realm by bringing all of his wild animal buddies into the villages to terrorize them, right? This is very similar to Usopp because Usopp would often cry wolf, saying that pirates were coming to the island. Of course, this wasn't true until it eventually was. So I think in that way, he and Usopp parallel. But where he and Frankie parallel is that he, like Frankie, was the little brother to somebody else because, of course, Frankie's big brother in the past was Iceberg and Loki's big brother is Hydroden. The brothers in question are often seen as the more responsible of the two, as Iceberg now is the mayor of Water 7 and Hydroden is the captain of the new giant warrior pirates and wants to be the king of the giants. So not only are they more responsible, both of them have loftier goals. As too, Iceberg wants to turn Water 7 into a floating vessel. So the two of them are more responsible or are considered more responsible than Frankie and Loki. However, Loki also has the tendency of being favored by his father alongside Hydroden, as Tom was with Frankie and Iceberg. This is interesting because both of their fathers end up being killed in a way by the world government, as Tom was taken away by the world government after the construction of the sea train, and Harold, Loki and Hydroden's father, was taken over by Emu and asked Loki essentially to kill him so that he couldn't be a danger to Elbaf. So yes, both of their fathers were killed by the world government in a way. The interesting part here is that Loki also ends up losing his mother alongside Hydroden because his true mother was Ida, which is Hydroden's birth mother. But he also loses Estrid, his birth mother. So he loses both of his mothers. This makes him similar to Usopp because Usopp lost his mother Bettina during his childhood. But what's also interesting about these three is that all three of them have some sort of hammer attack. Before obtaining Ragnar, the hammer that ate the squirrel fruit mythical type model Ratatasker, Loki used a hammer as his primary weapon in his adulthood. He then switched to Ragnar after competing in a contest of strength with the hammer in question, now using that as his primary weapon. Usopp throughout the series of One Piece, and we've talked about this extensively. I even use this as an example to predict Ragnar being the Ratatasker fruit user 3 years ago, but Usopp has always used a hammer in a multitude of attacks, and it's always been a pretty prominent lie in his arsenal, tricking the opponent into believing that the hammer is bigger and heavier than it actually is, but come to find out, it's usually some sort of balloon type trick that he has concocted just to scare his opponents. And finally, Frankie uses a series of metal punches that he calls hammers, such as Strong Hammer and Ultimate Hammer, which is very thematic for him because he is a shipwright. So of course he would use a hammer regardless because that's a needed tool for his occupation. And in the post time skip, he keeps a toolbox in one of his arms that most likely has a hammer inside. So keeping all that in mind, there's also a funny nose theme between the three, as Usopp has a very long nose, Frankie has a metal nose, and in the post time skip, if you hold down his nose, that changes his hairstyle. But oddly, Loki is a bit of a middle gap between these two because his nose does technically grow because he is the user of the, spoilers for Elbaf, dragon fruit mythical type model Nidhogg. So his nose grows into a snout once he becomes a dragon, but in his normal state, he also has this weird metal shell over his nose. So like Usopp, he technically has a long nose as a dragon, and like Frankie, he has a metal nose in a way, seeing as how he wears this metallic shell over his nose most of the time. But continuing off of that, like Frankie, Loki has identical shoulder and arm tattoos because in the pre-time skip, Frankie has always had 2 stars on his forearms, and during the fight with Funkaro, we see that he has 2 matching BF-36 tattoos on his shoulders. This is then upgraded to BF-37 in the post time skip, as that is what is printed on his big red ball shoulders. And of course, the star tattoos remain on his forearms. Loki has 2 matching sun tattoos on his shoulders, which then follow down into his arms, resembling the rays from those 2 sun tattoos. And this is a bit of a rarity in One Piece because usually One Piece has a bunch of asymmetrical designs. So it's pretty rare for a character to have 2 of anything that matches on their person all the time. So it's kind of interesting that Frankie and Loki have that in common. But continuing off of that, it's also quite interesting that both Loki and Frankie have breath attacks, and Frankie has been able to breathe fire since his introduction through a technique called fresh fire, whereas Loki, now being a thunder dragon, has the ability to breathe lightning. So if Loki does join the crew, he and Frankie will be the only 2 characters that have actual breath attacks. This is also quite interesting when you consider that both Frankie and Loki and Usopp were all seen as delinquents. And as I mentioned earlier, Frankie and Loki have responsible brothers, but they were always seen as the troublemakers. But their respective fathers loved them regardless. And what's interesting about the respective fathers, Tom and Harold, is that they too have a lot of similarities, as both of them are non-humans, both of them have horns, and both of them have tattoos and beards, which is very interesting. But now, bringing things back to Usopp, all 3 of these characters have been the leaders of their own respective organizations that do increase in intensity the farther you go on in the story, because Usopp was the leader of the Usopp Pirates, but essentially that's just a bunch of kids in a random East Blue village playing pirate. But then you get to Frankie, who was the leader of the Frankie family, whom were a group of ship dismantlers and crooks, whom had some dealings with the black market. But then when you get to Loki, Loki is the captain of some unnamed pirate group and was responsible for attacking multiple ships. So in that way, all 3 of them have been leaders in some regard throughout the narrative of the series. However, on top of that, both have had figmented versions of themselves presented by other characters' imaginations before they were officially introduced, because it is Luffy who draws a weird doodle of a guy of how he wants his shipwright to look like, and that Doodle does end up bearing some resemblance to Frankie once he's officially introduced. This happens too with Loki, because Loki first appears within the vision of Charlotte Chiffon, Lola's sister. However, when Loki actually does appear in the story, he looks nothing like Chiffon's vision. However, a funny vestige of said vision is in his design, as the Jolly Roger on his belt does look like the weird little guy with the three-pronged crown that Chiffon envisioned. So, seeing as how Frankie and Loki have so much in common, I could believe in the future, if the family dynamic was ever revised, that Frankie and Loki would be brothers, making Loki the presumed uncle of the Straw Hat Pirates. But with that being said, if you are enjoying the video so far, click the like button. And if you want to see more from me, hit the subscribe button, followed by that bell so you never miss a video. In addition to, if you could, hit the hype button, because it really does help. And with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works.